It is with great pleasure that I welcome on stage Steve Blank and JD Schramm.
Hi. I think they all came for the gifts.
Steve, thanks for being here this evening.
Thanks for having me.
You have seen many of the questions some of the questions that have come in. We had 164 questions.
And I only have 2 answers, so it's...
So I think we'll be here until midnight as we go through them. But what we've been able to do is categorize and look at some of them that evolve around themes for this evening. Looking specifically at being an entrepreneur, being an investor, and then also your role as an author, mentor, thought leader in the space. I will ask questions up here until about 8 o'clock. Then we will open it up for some questions from the audience at the 2 microphones, and then we will wrap and do the Twitter awards. So,
Great.
This one came in from several of the participants who are here. What do you see as the first step in launching a startup? Where does somebody begin?
Well, you know, you could launch a startup from a million different directions, but, you know, historically, launching a startup is an act of passion and aggression, and it is not a passive activity. You know, entrepreneurs, at least in my mind, we actually have characterized them or mischaracterized them for decades. I think entrepreneurs are closer to artists than any other field. That is, founders of companies, not early employees, but founders of companies feel something inside that they need to express. And typically they have vision and passion that they need to get out of their system, much like a sculptor or a painter or a composer. Usually they want to build something for themselves or want to solve a problem that they not only have for themselves or others. And most often it's product and vision driven. But there are many ways to come to starting a company, but that's the one I kind of feel is the most authentic. The valley has gotten so now big, and we're in one of these bubble phases again, that people confuse entrepreneurship as a job. And for those of you who do, you're incredibly mistaken. Being a founder is a calling. It's not a job. And if you're not called to be a founder, don't do it, because the odds are you'd make more money working at Walmart or McDonald's than you will as a founder of a company. It's the world's most miserable job. You know, how many have been a founder of a company? Right, your co-founders quit, your biggest customer, you know, pulls their order, the toilets stop up at 2 in the morning, you're the facilities person. I mean, you know, if the first time you run into that, you're thinking it's a job, you're gonna just like quit and go home. But if those are just obstacles you're removing to kind of get to your vision, then all they are is just you're Michelangelo where everybody else saw that 12-foot block of marble, and you just removed the stone around it, and there was the Pieta. That's what a founder does. What was your question?
You answered it exactly. Where does somebody start? They start with passion and aggression, and that it's a calling. Yeah. As you look at entrepreneurs that you've seen...
Good, I'm glad you're taking notes, because I don't even remember.
As you look at the entrepreneurs you've worked with and that you've seen, are there key characteristics of a successful entrepreneur? Are there things that you look for that you know that person is going to be more successful?
Well, if I knew that, I'd be running a venture firm or at least a hedge fund. Let me just start with, if somebody would have looked at me in my 20s and asked if I was going to be successful, they probably would have asked which prison was he going to. So you know, people grow and emerge and learn at different rates. You know, I came to Silicon Valley and apprenticed for over a decade and a half before I was even competent, barely, to kind of co-found and then run startups. And some of my students are, you know, truly capable in their 20s right out of school. So number one, it kind of depends on, you know, how astute you are and what your learning curve is. But 2 is, I'll go back to the comments I made earlier. One is, you have to be passionate, and you have to be driven, and you have to be relentless and agile. And that's kind of the checklist, and there are others, a couple I never hear people talk about, but you have to be infinitely curious, not only about your field, but others, because sometimes startups are about pattern recognition. You see patterns from, music are applied here, or from, physics are applied to math, to computer science. And again, now with this whole lean startup stuff, adversity should be your middle name, meaning not that you create it, but you recover from it. And funny enough, I started asking this question, and then I finally gave up because I convinced myself. It turns out the most successful entrepreneurs, not that I suggest you go through this, but are those who come from dysfunctional families. Or have struggled through great event, and I've modified that for my students who weren't born in the U.S. or who struggled to travel both great cultural and physical distances to come to the Valley. And the reason why it's no joke, for those of you who come from dysfunctional families, for the first time in your life, you have a competitive advantage. Because it's probably the cruelest training ground ever. If you're a functional survivor, you were dealing with how to bring order out of chaos your entire life, and you focused on how to keep all the extraneous noise away from what's just important for survival. Guess what? That's the job spec of a founding CEO. And it is that and maybe combat and Fallujah were probably the two best, seriously. So first lieutenants or captains who've been in combat, or survivors of dysfunctional family, has probably been through the best boot camp of running early stage process. It turns out, at least for dysfunctional CEOs, they have one downside, and that is when they do find a repeatable and scalable business model, they throw emotional hand grenades into their own company to keep the chaos going, because that's the only state they're comfortable in. And some of you are like looking at each other going, uh-oh, do they have my number? And I only tell you this because when I thought I saw this pattern, I told my favorite VC, Catherine Gould, Catherine, did you ever notice blah, 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 blah? She looked at me like the dog just talked, and she said, Steve, what do you think we hired you for? She said, that's who all my CEOs are. So there was other venture capitalists who figured that out.
I'm waiting for the first slide deck that one of my students at Ignite presents that shows their family of origin and talks about the alcoholism and the
dysfunction.
In your customer development model, one of the participants who has obviously read your books and read your blogs asked if when you're doing a bootstrapped business, rather than something that you've got investment behind, are there any modifications to the customer development model because of being bootstrapped?
Well, this whole phrase lean startup, people confuse with cheap startup. And a lean startup has nothing to do with cheap startup. A lean startup and the customer development process is all about when do you apply the cash. The mistake we made before the last bubble crashed is we assumed that you raised the most money, spent it all, and then assumed magic would happen. And here what we're looking for is can you test enough hypotheses to when you do think something is repeatable, then you double down with the money available. And so if you're bootstrapping, the question you have to ask yourself is, are you actually setting yourself up for a lifestyle business or a small business, versus are you putting all the chips in the middle for a scalable startup? Not that you should just go out and raise venture money, but what is the scale you're looking for? And if I could segue, when I started teaching after being an entrepreneur, people who allowed me to teach were smart enough and said, why don't you sit through some other entrepreneurship classes? I got to tell you, I sat through a couple and I was staggered because what they were teaching wasn't what I thought was entrepreneurship, and I had done it for 21 years. It turns out that...
Wait a minute, you mean that there are people in academia who didn't have practical experience? I can say that.
I'm usually not at a loss for words, but just as an aside, and then it'll remind me to get back to this subject. With all due respect, Berkeley and Stanford probably have the best adjunct program probably in the country. We take it for granted here. But for all its quirks and for all the, faculty garbage you got to put through, seriously, Stanford and Berkeley love practitioners, bring them in, allow them to teach, give them great support. And in fact, you're all whoever went through the Ignite program are recipients of the fact that these universities actually embrace external knowledge. That's not true all over the country. And so I'm hesitating because you and I live kind of the vagaries of that process, but for gosh sake, it really does work at these universities.
You were talking about the first time you sat in some entrepreneurship classes.
Yeah. So what really happened was, for those of you who don't know my background, 8 startups, 21 years, but every startup was, $1 billion or bust. And I say that just to give you the idea of scale. We weren't doing some small business. So when I kind of thought I was going to teach entrepreneurship, that was it's the only entrepreneurship I thought existed. And it turns out that's just BS. But what we didn't have was a taxonomy to explain what are the types of entrepreneurship, and it's okay to be these other types. We just needed to understand what they were. So I've come up with one that at least helps me understand is, number one, there are lifestyle entrepreneurs. People work for themselves, but really have no interest in the business. They work so they can enjoy whatever else they're doing. I live near the coast, in fact, on the coast, and I have friends who love to surf. They would stay in the water all day if they could, and they live in little surf shacks, and the sign on their surf shack says surfing lessons 9:45 to 10:15. And that's what they've calculated is enough to keep them in food and lights. That's a lifestyle business. There are other businesses that are entrepreneurial, and in hindsight, I should have known this because my parents were immigrants, and their goal, when they finally achieved it, was to open up a grocery store in Chelsea, New York. And they were small business entrepreneurs. Turns out 50% of all non-governmental employees in the U.S. run small businesses. We're still a nation of shopkeepers. But small business entrepreneurs are not what we do in Silicon Valley. Right? In Silicon Valley, we do one of two things. We either build scalable startups. By scalable, I mean you wake up and you're going to take over the universe. You're going to be Apple or Facebook or Twitter or Google or whatever else we haven't invented, or Tesla or something, and you're going for broke and you're pushing all the chips in the middle. Or nowadays, there's a variant of this in the Valley and in other places. Amazon Web Services and other things have made, and app stores have made entrepreneurship available to people who want to do, I'll call viable startups, typically apps, sometimes web businesses, where an exit might be $5 or $10 million, and that's just great if you're 23 years old, or even if you're 53 years old, that might be a nice exit. But it's those last two are what we actually do and teach in entrepreneurship in the Valley. And what we don't do or teach is historically small business entrepreneurship or lifestyle entrepreneurship. Now in the last couple of years, just as an aside, corporations, for the first time in the history of the modern corporation, are now looking to early stage ventures for how to do internal innovation inside of corporations. It used to be that a large company could follow the 20th century rules of Jack Welch and say, I'll own a segment, I'll be number 1 and 2, I'll defend that segment for the next 10 or 15 years. Every large company now understands those rules don't work in the 21st century. Not because they've been stupid, but the external environment has changed. China is a manufacturer, China is a competitor, the internet makes pricing transparent, startups now are a lot more agile, et cetera. So every large company is now trying to do much more than just process innovation. They're trying to do continuous innovation. And the people who are actually masters of continuous innovation are early stage ventures in Silicon Valley. So those are the types of startups, and I realized once we have that taxonomy, then we could understand who are we teaching, what do we want to teach them, and how do we teach them.
What can do with that? As you look at the challenge of being an entrepreneur, which you talked about a moment ago, it's a very difficult job. How do you stay focused? When you were running your business, how do you eliminate the noise and be laser focused on what your goals are?
I'll truly go back to having that training of both of them. I had the Venn diagram of both military and dysfunctional families, so maybe I had an advantage. Plus, if you grow up in New York, you always know how to push your way to the front of the line. So I couldn't believe people stood in line in California. That's still my, what are these people doing? And by the way, if you're an entrepreneur and you're standing in the line, you're not an entrepreneur.
Should have watched the pizza line,
Right.
there were a lot of entrepreneurs pushing their way to the front of the pizza line.
Yeah, but the real entrepreneur would have, in fact, grabbed a box of pizza and started selling it to the other folks. Now, I want to know that person. That would have been me. What was the question?
How do you stay focused?
Yeah, right. So what's really interesting, and I was pretty good at this until neurons started dying at this age, was understanding that my eyes were always on the prize. And so I was pretty good at having long-range vision and goals, and but I had relentless, what I would call tactical execution skills of ruthlessly eliminating any obstacle on the path to that goal. But my goal was not the next release or the 2.0 version. It was, what does the world look like when I change it? And getting the people and the resources and everything was heading to that goal. Now, obviously, in hindsight, before we actually gave rise to the word pivot and lean startup, the goals would change as I got smarter, but though great entrepreneurs always reinvent the past, and so I'd convince you I already had that. I was actually going over here. But the idea is your eyes on the prize, but it has to be coupled with the relentless execution to get to that prize. And that means resources and people and customers and orders and all that stuff.
So far I've been talking more general, that questions that can apply to almost anyone, although they came from different participants. A few people have asked very specific questions, and I know at the end you're going to get 6-word tweets that you're going to advise, but a few specific questions. One person wants to know how they can apply agile development to a hardware startup. Sure.
That question always comes from, well, I don't know how to do minimum viable products in hardware. Gee, I'm going to burn some silicon. How can I actually test an MVP? And just a reminder for the rest of you, one of the notions, let me just maybe give you a quick 30-second summary. This whole lean startup process has a couple ideas. One is that startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Today, that might be intuitively obvious, but when I was an entrepreneur, that was heretical. What do you mean? Large companies write business plans? My investors told me I write a plan. Large companies hire VPs of sales, marketing, and biz dev on day one? That's what they told me to do. Large companies write 5-year plans and income statements and balance sheets and cash flow? That's not only what they told me to do, that's what I was getting funded to do, and that's how they were going to measure my progress in the board meetings. Never once realizing, by the way, that a 5-year plan in a startup is just a series of unknowns, right? Where a 5-year plan in an existing company might be a series of knowns. And no one ever said that, gee, the only people to execute 5-year plans on a series of unknowns were venture capitalists in the Soviet Union. But we did it anyway because there was no alternative. And then when I retired, I started thinking about, well, wait a minute, what worked and what didn't? And it was pretty lonely at the time, just saying, I don't think this is right. I think when I succeeded and when others succeeded, we actually blew out those rules and observed something different. And the observation is large companies execute known business models, but startups search for business models. And this distinction between search and execution is the core idea behind the lean startup. The lean startup says that we need some tools now for searching for a business model. And so what are those 3 components or tools? One is something called the business model canvas, which allows us to frame and articulate a series of hypotheses. That is, my belief, and if you think about it, it's more than likely true, is that almost every startup is a series of untested hypotheses. Large companies have already tested their hypotheses because they have revenue and customers and channel and whatever, and they're in an execution mode. But you as founders, you kind of have hypotheses. And by the way, I use the word hypotheses at Stanford because you're paying $50,000 a year. But outside of Stanford, the word hypotheses means what? Guesses, or effing guesses, right? So we're just guessing. And so we need a way to frame those guesses, and we use something called the Business Model Canvas by Alexander Osterwalder. If you haven't gotten his book, you can download it. It's brilliant. But the second thing is, if all we're doing is writing down hypotheses, then all we've done is moved our business plan to little yellow stickies, but still a untested plan. And so the second part, which is my invention, is we need to get out of the building and rapidly test those hypotheses. And that's called the customer development process. And that was the book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. The third part, which was also the 4 steps, but Eric Ries's major contribution, and is the fact that as you're going out and testing hypotheses of who are the customers, what's the channel, how do I create demand, what's the revenue model, you actually want to be building the product iteratively and incrementally. And in software, we kind of invented that process in the last decade or so. It's agile engineering, and Toyota and others have done it in hardware, and it's not a radically new invention, but it's now kind of a standard and understood methodology. These 3 components, business model design, customer development, and agile engineering, make up the lean startup. And some of the buzzwords you hear, iterations, pivots, minimum viable products, are part of that. For example, an iteration is a minor change to one or more of the business model components. A pivot is a major change. I might be changing, an iteration is I'm changing pricing from $4.99 to $9.99. A pivot says, gee, I'm changing from freemium to direct sales. That's a pretty big pivot. Or I'm changing my customer segment from urban youth to housewives in the Midwest. Major pivot. And by the way, sometimes we confuse pivot with attention deficit disorder. Note to audience, they're not the same. All right, they're very different. The other buzzword, minimum viable product, says, look, instead of building what we used to do, which is alpha test, beta test, first customer ship, iOS 8.01, et cetera, then 8.02, then, bin the phone. What we really, we could talk about Steve Jobs versus Tim Cook later.
That one's not on the list. You're okay.
But the difference now is we realize, well, wait a minute. Instead of building a prototype, why don't we build an iterative series of prototypes, easy to understand in software? And now to answer your question, but Steve, how do you build silicon in MVPs? And I'm going to give you a very concrete example.
There you go.
That's going to be very loud.
Thanks. I feel like we're on the game show now. And behind the door, is a pivot. A pivot 1 is,
there's a whole generation that doesn't know that.
Oh, no, right, okay.
Yeah.
But I seem to have the right generation in the room. So that was a great startup. Hyperspectral scanner, fly it over whatever, great project in the class. Get a call from the student, hi, Professor Blank, we're raising $100,000 for our MVP, you want to kick some money in? And I go, well, I get that all the time, but then they always get the hysterical laughter at the end. But I said, what are you doing? They said, well, Professor Blank, hyperspectral scanner, drone, farm field, $100,000. You need to build a drone. And I went, I don't understand. And so they just kind of figured I was either deaf and or stupid and explained it again. I said, no, I hear what you want to do, but your hardware MVP should cost you $1.99. And then there was like silence. Well, no, we need to build a drone, and we don't have to build the scanner. We could rent it, but $100,000. I said, maybe one of us are confused, but what business are you in? Drone, hyperspectral scanner. I said, what grade did I give you? Because I'm thinking about taking it back. It's, as for the Stanford students, grades go from A to A+. That's the Stanford curve.
Oh, you use the entire curve.
The entire curve, right. By the way, I once actually had to tell some students that if they didn't work harder, I was going to show them something they had never seen before and drew the letter B on a whiteboard. And they all looked at each other, what is that? I've never seen that before. So anyway, I kind of explained to them, we just kind of did the Socratic method for a while. I said, what is it that you're selling? And they would get drone and spray. I said, no, what are you selling? What were they selling? Any idea? Anybody know what they were selling? Yeah, of course. To who? To farmers. Were they selling drones? Were they selling hyperspectral scanners? No. What could they have done to prototype their business? talked to farmers and show them a little printout with data and said, would you pay if I could give you this data on a weekly or daily or monthly basis? Had nothing to do with the drone or the... This is a very long and shaggy dog story to say, sometimes, yes, admittedly, you might have to do a hardware prototype, but almost always you could be testing those features somewhat earlier. We're trying to understand customer needs. And this really confuses engineers. Engineers sometimes think that an MVP is just a de-featured product. It is not. A minimum viable product is sometimes a PowerPoint deck, or a mock-up, or a show me the data and will you pay for that, versus, so when we started MIPS computers, I remember I got a $10 million order from Prime just when John Hennessy was able to draw the words 10 MIPS on the whiteboard. And like the head of Prime, computer company said, if you could do that, you got a deal. And we did, and then we had to deliver it, which took us more years than we thought, but actually worked. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. You moved nicely into the next bucket of topics, and that is as an investor. And near and dear to my heart, since I teach students and coach students how to do pitches, can you highlight the most effective aspects of an investor pitch that you've seen beyond knowing what you're selling? Is there anything else that they should be doing?
Yeah, it's the one that gets you the check.
Ask.
So, and almost semi-seriously, let's not confuse fundraising with getting it right. I mean, fundraising is when the check clears. But there is a different model if you've gone through the lean startup methodology, and again, it depends on who your audience is. And, if you've gone through a Y Combinator, it's about whether you have your voice can project and whether you use the right font, and you have a great demo. But if you go through, the I-Core, for me, it's what did you learn from the last 100 customers you spoke to, which is a very different set of data. Because I'm interested in let me say it again, I'm interested, and the National Science Foundation and now the NIH and whatever is not interested on where you are at this point in time. I want to understand your velocity and trajectory, and the only way I could do that is tell me what were your initial hypotheses, what did you learn, did you have any pivots, and how did you get to where you are, and then where do you think you're going? Boy, that's a lot different than here's my great slides and demo and go invest on me on this point in time. So that's what I tend to look for, but make sure who you're pitching, because there might be people who go, I don't want to hear that. I just want to know how sexy your demo is. Okay.
But the key piece in there is know your audience. And for you particularly, it's being able to speak to what did you learn from the customers you've spoken to.
I want to know, everybody has an idea nowadays. Your dog has an idea. And they're being given this bubble, they're probably getting funded. But I'm interested in me is how quickly are you learning, and do you know what it is you're supposed to be learning about? Nice. If you're familiar with the business model canvas, the two most important things, if you're in web and mobile, is what's called product market fit, the combination between your value proposition, what you're building, and customer segments. And then, if you could get some more data, cost of acquisition, that is get, keeping, and grow customers, and then revenue model. And then if it's something social about, how does it scale and how big, how big can it get and how do you monetize those users, et cetera. If you're in life sciences, there are different things you worry about. But so I want to understand that story. Do you even understand, the components of what you need to understand, and how quickly are you learning all these things? And there's a process to do this now. I mean, that's what we teach at Stanford, and that's what's kind of been adopted by the U.S. government as so we're probably running the second or third largest incubator in the world.
Can you talk, to that point, can you talk a little bit from what you know of Ignite and the distinctions between the Ignite curriculum and the I-Core curriculum? And actually, let me just see, how many participants in here have done the Ignite program? How many alumni, Ignite alumni? It looks like about a fourth of the audience, and 3/4 are prospects who will submit their applications by October 6th, Bruce?
So Ignite is the smartest, best, most well put together, thoughtful, whatever program that ever existed.
Can we get him some chocolates?
Right.
That was really good. No, seriously, what do you see as the distinctions that are out there and things to keep in mind in creating curricula?
So, when I started teaching, I'm almost embarrassed to admit, I taught what was being taught elsewhere, particularly at Stanford. I was teaching the how to write a business plan class, which is probably the worst thing ever to teach an entrepreneur. Because one of the things we now know is no business plan survives first contact with customers. It's a big idea. Like you're planning like this 5-year project that we know is just simply wrong. And a very smart, particularly if you're in Stanford, you could go hack together a business plan over a weekend in the business school library. It's a bunch of crap. Entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship education is experiential. It's a big idea. If you're not getting your hands dirty, you're not like learning anything. And it's not just, purely vocational, because what we teach is theory and practice, but it'd be like going to medical school and just reading the books and then try to, practice brain surgery on someone you like. We would never kind of expect that that's how we train surgeons or artists or anything else, but we somehow used to teach entrepreneurship like we taught accounting. And we do know that accountants don't run startups. My apologies for the one accountant who might be in the room trying to start a company, but get another job. I mean, it's not going to work.
Or at the very least, a co-founder.
No, you could be the CFO when they have some money to count. And so what I did, and I'll let the audience compare and contrast to Ignite, is said, let's strip out all the other superfluous stuff. And then what really matters is teaching exactly the things I've been talking about, which is let's teach them some theory. What's a business model? What are the 9 components of customers and channels and partners and activities and resources and get, keep, and grow and revenue model, et cetera. Let's teach customer development. Let's teach, agile engineering. But let me make you get out of the building for 10 weeks. 10 weeks, you are going to talk to 10 to 15 customers a week as a team. Come back in the class every week and present in front of your peers and teaching team, who will give you politely course correction and repeat for 10 or 15 weeks. There is no, income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. There is no marketing class. There is no whatever. I believe all these are precursors to you should be so lucky to need to know sales and marketing and finance, because once you get out, you will be understanding that. And by the way, if you're an engineer, this is the best training in the world, because the difference between an introvert and an extrovert for great engineers, whether they're looking at their shoes or your shoes. And only half the room is laughing. So can you explain it to the people over here? So we teach them how to make eye contact in 10 weeks. I mean, so it turns out we have now trained teams of 400 of the country's best scientists and engineers on how to do that, principal investigators who are tenured faculty, who are great scientists, on a method that, what do they know from entrepreneurship? But in fact, what the National Science Foundation recognized about this class, which at Stanford is called the Lean Launchpad and in the government is called the Innovation Core, or I-Core, is that it almost modeled the scientific method of, have a hypothesis, set up an experiment, get out of the building and gather some data, extract some insight and modify the hypotheses. And it is a shock and awe process of actually turning your ideas into a potential either startup or license or industry university collaboration. And it's been pretty effective. How that compares to Ignite is, I don't know, other than I know you have some great faculty teaching some great business school classes, but this I-Core process is just focused on a very specific goal, which is to teach people with ideas or technology how to validate or invalidate whether that's a scalable business in 10 weeks.
For those who've gone through the Ignite program, if you want to ask questions about that when we get to the audience portion in a moment, one hallmark elements of the Ignite program that I've seen in my coaching with it is all students come in with a business idea that they want to work on through the 11 weeks, but they form into teams where one of the ideas, the idea generator, gets to move that forward and the others become a part of that team. And we do strive to keep it very experiential, but what I find in my coaching is that it may not be your idea that you're moving forward, but everything you're learning about design thinking, about communication, about business models, you can apply to your own idea. So it's a lab.
You said something interesting, and I just, maybe for this audience, because it is around Stanford, I should point out, because it's just actually, even I started understanding it. You know, we use the word design thinking a lot. Design thinking and customer development are 180 degrees different. And should I give you 30 seconds?
Yes, please.
And let me, again, I'll bookend this on both sides. One of them is not better than the other. They're just different tools for different jobs. And I can only talk about design thinking because I read about it, but I can talk about customer development because I invented it. And customer development was invented from my observation that at least in Silicon Valley and for the government and coming out of technology labs and coming out of corporate R&D labs, we don't come out saying, gee, I wonder what the market wants. We come out with a technology or a vision or a product that we very desperately need to find customers for. For better or worse, that's how Silicon Valley tended to do startups. I have a technology invention or a vision for a product. Now let me raise money. Oops, I got burn rate with a gun to my head. Where are my customers? Anybody recognize that? Customer development was a process to solve those problems. Problem number one was, I have urgency like you've never had before in your life. That urgency is every startup founder knows 3 numbers. Your burn rate, how much money you're spending per month. 2, how much cash you'll have left in the bank. And 3, the exact day you can no longer make payroll. And you're losing sleep at that every night. So there's a urgency that doesn't exist in a large corporation.
Right.
You're going out of business and or your company's, you're going to lay people off. 2 is you got this idea, which you immediately thought on day one that, like, why, of course, the only problem you're going to have in your company is you have a big enough building to put the bags of money. And as soon as you get out, you find out that no one other than you kind of think it's a good idea. Well, now very quickly, you need to find that product market fit. So urgency, customer driven. Design thinking starts from a very different direction. Its goal is to find a customer need where you could eventually develop a product for. But it does not start with a product. It starts with, let's understand the customer space, build some prototypes, and this isn't the fault of design thinking, it's just where it comes from.
Where it's evolved.
Urgency is not usually built into the process. There is no gun to your head. You could create one, but there is no one that's designed in. And so in a perfect world, and again, I just want to make sure you heard it from me, in a perfect world, we would never do customer development, we'd only do design thinking. But that's not how both the Valley's engineered and where technology comes from. We don't do needs finding first. We tend to invent things, fund them, and then get surprised when there are no customers at the end. So that's why I invented customer development. And by the way, some of the outcomes of customer development is you operate under good enough decision making. This drives both people who will not make decisions without sufficient data and large company CFOs insane. In a startup, you are making good enough decisions constantly. And in fact, I teach there are only 2 types of decisions in a startup: revocable and irrevocable decisions. Revocable decisions, what order the features and what do we price the product, you make in the same meeting the issue comes up. You do not have some committee or say, let's think about it. We are making that decision now. It's revocable. We'll make it 5 times again in the lifetime of the company. Irrevocable decisions, sign the 10-year lease, take money from this venture capitalist or someone else, almost impossible to back out of. But you are making decisions at speed and tempo because of urgency, and that's tied into this customer development process. Boy, in a large company, if you're making some product line bets, you could put the division or potentially the company out of business, i.e. C. Newton for Apple, for example, or some other product failures that we know about. So therefore, you need much more data than you do in an early stage venture. So I answered a question you didn't even ask, but...
It was down here.
Okay.
I was going to ask that one next, so we got 2 for 1. The last question I want to ask, and then we will open it up to the audience at the 2 mics, at the 2 mic stands. But because of your work, you've really become a thought leader in this space. Your books have sold well. You were doing autographs beforehand.
I still laugh, actually. You got to know, every once in a while, I get together with Eric Ries and or Osterwalder, and I look at all of them and say, what if we're wrong? We'd be setting all you guys back, you know. What the hell? What do I know? I don't know. Sounds pretty good.
But your books, your blog, which is prolific, the speeches you've given, the videos, you've inspired a lot of other people to write and think, other books that have come out. What are you most proud of? When you look at what people have done with your ideas and taken them further, what do you look at and go, I'm glad that happened that way?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a very funny answer. I guess I'm most proud of, I actually have kids who still talk to me now that they're grown. Being able to do 8 startups and raise a family and still keep a notion of family is probably the hardest thing for a irrational entrepreneur to have. Because of all of you know, you don't get a memo that says go home to have dinner with your family. In fact, entrepreneurial pressures actually have you go in the other direction. And Silicon Valley cost me a marriage. Luckily, I didn't have children. And to be honest, I still feel sorry for my ex-wife because she once asked, when we knew it was over, when she said, what's more important, me or your work? And I was sitting there thinking, no, and I still remember the moment. Let me compute, let's see. And she looked at me, and we both kind of giggled. And luckily, we held hands as we got divorced, but it was truly not and I got smarter.
That's one of those irrevocable
decisions. I got smarter, and luckily I had kids later, and my wife had been through startups. She was like the second evangelist at Apple, and so she understood what this business was. But if anybody wants to read the rules we made up, not like we were smart to make them all up, but there's a blog post, just search for something called the Epitaph for an Entrepreneur. And it was kind of the sum of all the rules we kind of made up to, I had to be home for dinner every night with the kids. I had to put them to bed. We took 3-week vacations every year. We, celebrated secular religious holidays every week. The whole shtick that, I got kids who talk to me, and actually, they're probably actually calling for their mom, but they just pretend they're talking to me. But I had watched people who I incredibly admired at work, kind of my role models. But over time, I realized their children hated them, and that was not a model I wanted. Nice. So I guess I could give you lots of techie stuff, but the Valley really doesn't do a good job in this because. For a venture capitalist, why would I want you to do that, right? I'm not optimizing your home life. I'm optimizing, my portfolio and the liquidity event. I just think that's we don't hear enough of, and I don't want to get into your life should be balanced. Bullshit. If I hear your life's balanced, I'm not investing in you. I just worked 28 hours a day. Literally, when my kids went to bed, I was back on email for another 5 hours. My life was not balanced. In fact, the minute I hear I want a balanced life, go get a job in a big company until you want your life unbalanced. So that's not the same as, take care of your family and set your priorities. But, this is an exhausting 24/7 game, and having a balanced family just makes it more exhausting. It doesn't make it less work, does that?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Right. Thanks.
So, thanks.
I want to open up to folks in the audience. If you want to come forward, there's a mic stand at the bottom of each set of stairs. We'll be able to get through just a few questions. Everything I asked tonight, with one exception, were things that were fueled by the emails in advance. So if there's something that you didn't get to ask that you want to ask, we'll get through a few here before we get to the games. We'll start over here, please.
Hi, Steve. My name is Mike. I'm from Singapore, and I took your class online with some facilitator in Singapore. And when I was actually taking the class, I had a bit of disagreement with the facilitator, so I just want to hear your thoughts on that. So I'm actually working on a social networking app, and at the time during the course, I actually have a static wireframe. And the facilitator basically said that, hey, you should just take the static wireframes and go out and test out your hypothesis. So, but I hesitated because I thought, there are some ideas that I think it has a tangible problems, and it's much easier for you to ask the potential customers, to verify your hypothesis. But for something like social networking, or something that, the ideas that actually need the customers to kind of experience. I mean, I can show them a static wireframe with a follow or unfollow button, on static, but I kind of feel that you need an interactive, actually at working MVP for you to really test out those hypotheses. Do you think I'm wrong, or do you think I should have just...
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Next question.
Is there another question?
And I don't mean you, so I'm not just going to generalize. No, stay here. You'll get you get to disagree one more time.
Sure, yeah.
And I don't mean to, but sometimes what's the right MVP to test ends up as a pissing contest, and I don't mean that in a nasty way, other than I mean it in a nasty way. It's not like, we got to wait. If in fact your first instinct is we got to wait till later till I'm done, you're wrong. And so the answer is really, what can you test now? And if the answer is you could test nothing now, I'll contend you're not thinking hard enough. Meaning, yes, there are apps that require either the immersion in the, how do you test Oculus VR without having some VR? But, there were ways to mock it up, and they actually did it in various stages. How do you test, stickiness of some social app or some virality or some network effects? I don't know the answer here, but the discussion should have not been, I'm right, you're right. It should have been, how can we brainstorm? What are the components that we need to test? And are there any, for me, cheap hacks to go do that? And maybe the final test was, well, great, we've now proven that we can't do this until we get to something more immersive. But I always think you could be learning continually. I kind of find, and again, I'm not talking about you, just in general, because I hear this a lot. I kind of find that, well, we can't figure out what to test until I write more code, is the answer of an engineer. It's like, I need to be coding some more because that's my comfort zone, not of, I need to be learning and testing. It might be that you learn and test enough to figure out, why, yes, we do need a lot more code before we have valid data. Does that answer your question? Or pushback?
Yes. Not sure I'm 100% convinced, though. I still think that there's something that, well...
This is a nice conference room discussion that goes on for. All right, well, thank you.
Thanks, sir.
And just as an aside, that's a subtle variant on a bigger issue is, how can I do customer discovery on something that hasn't been invented yet? And it turns out this was something else that used to, confuse me, is, the classic Steve Jobs of we don't, test stuff, and if Henry Ford had tested the, car, he would have people would have said, I need a horse with 6 legs. It turns out there are multiple types of startups. The easiest one is those in an existing market where you're making something better or cheaper, right? An existing market is the customers not only know the name of the market, they could tell you the competitors, and they could tell you the basis of competition. Customer discovery is pretty easy. You go out and ask them a set of questions. But in a new market, one that doesn't exist at all, what do? How do you go ask them, would you like anti-gravity? I guess, okay. But it's not like in that's a default for going back to your office and locking the door. It turns out in that, customer discovery is actually quite different, but still valid. You want to understand the day in the life of the customer today, and how is it going to change when your invention changes their lives. There's no way you could a priori compute that until you really understand their day-to-day life now. And so there's a different type of discovery. And everybody who's in a new market believes they're a visionary, and the data says they're hallucinating, right? And so what we're trying to do is reduce that hallucination risk. But this is a variant in an existing market that says, gee, in social media, it's really network effect, and I need to test that, et cetera. And often it's, can we go out and figure out what kind of data we could gather now?
Good. Over
Next.
here.
Steve, how do you know exactly when you reached a repeatable and scalable business model, and is it when customer development finally stops?
So the answer part is, if you're a good CEO, customer development never stops, at least customer discovery. But how do you know when when you found a repeatable and scalable business model? That's a set of criteria that you, or hopefully you and your investors, have said, here are the numbers we need for scale, right? And the problem is it varies by business. And enterprise software, I remember when I got $5 million orders, I said, enough about discovery, time to go to, or enough about discovery and validation, time to go to customer creation. We're ready to scale and hire a sales force. But gee, if you got 5 orders for a web app, right? We're not even on the same planet. We need 5,000 or maybe 50,000 to find that something's repeatable. So one is it's application and industry dependent, and 2 is the risk always is that you've optimized a local maximum, either in users or business model, and that you actually should have been looking for something bigger and scalable or more. And that's the art and fingertip art of a great entrepreneur. And I wish I could give you the numeric data. It turns out that if you happen to be in social media, VCs, if you ask them enough, will tell you what the right numbers are, whether they're 1 million or 10 million, and the numbers always are going up every year about where is the monetizable number for scale and venture investment. And those are kind of well known and well understood, or at least if asked, they will tell you. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Over to here.
Hey, Steve, I'm Jason. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned you had laser focus when you were running companies. I wanted to ask, in my personal experience, I have that when I start out something. Now, there are days when you want that, you need that motivation to keep going. In your personal experience, what kept you going? Was it your team or your vision of seeing that product in the world? I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, startups are run by crazy people. No, seriously. I mean, if you don't consider yourself crazy, then I don't think you're equipped. And I'm not talking about you. Hopefully you're crazy. I mean, and by crazy I mean driven to make something big happen, and whatever it takes, I'm going to go do. Whether it was enterprise software or video games or something else, I was focused on the prize. And so what keeps you getting up in the morning was, I can't believe I'm getting closer to the prize. And sometimes you get setbacks and oops, I'm further away from the prize, but I'm not confused. I know where I need to keep going back. And if that doesn't excite you or continue to excite you, for God's sake, get out of the company and hand it to someone else. And I only had that happen to me once in my career. And and the lesson was I should have resigned as a CEO quickly. I was a co-founder of a video game company called Rocket Science Games. Made the cover of Wired magazine, Hollywood meets Silicon Valley, blah, blah, blah. In fact, 90 days after we were on the cover, I realized we're going to go out of business. And when we did, I, just as an aside, called my mother, who was a Russian immigrant, and English wasn't her first language. And I said, Mom, I'm calling you to tell you I just lost $35 million. Pause, translate. And then she said, so where'd you put it? I said, no, I'm calling you to tell you, it's gone, it's lost it. And then she broke it to Russian and Polish and Yiddish and several languages, saying, oh my God, there's nowhere else for us to go. The country we came from is gone. And then she said, and our name's blank. We can't even change it. Just as an aside, I remind visitors to Silicon Valley, when that happens, in Silicon Valley, we have a special word for failed entrepreneur. You might know what it is? Experienced. And I lived that case, and I'm going to answer your question in a sec. I lived that case because the VCs who lost $35 million gave me another $12 million that I turned into $1 billion each for them. And the Valley is full of those stories of failure and redemption. We're not much smarter than any other place in the world. What we are is we're the people who get multiple shots at the goal. That's the definition of an entrepreneurial cluster. Failure does not ruin your career. Now, after 3 or 4 of those, VCs stop returning your calls, but your parents will still talk to you, and no one's gonna break their knees. And back to your question, you need to be driven. And I don't mean you can't get depressed and you can't whatever, but if in fact you're not, and I'm not talking about you, I'm not personally pointing, but if you're not resilient enough, that is, if you're all not resilient enough to have that vision and passion for building something, make up for the inevitable despair and disappointments that occur in that journey, you're not crazy enough to do this job. And I mean it. It's not a job for normal people. It's a job for people who are irrational. Much like, why do artists keep painting when they don't sell, or sculpting, or why do people still compose or play music? It is something that's built into the psyche of some small but interesting subsegment of the human population. We have to cluster them here in Silicon Valley. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Over to here.
Hello, Steve. My name is Michael. So successful entrepreneurs probably have similar patterns while they achieve their goals. So I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think that Steve Jobs used lean startup?
You know, I think Jobs was probably one of the rare combinations of art and science that we've seen a couple of times, at least in the American century. Walt Disney had it. Edward Land had it. The founder of Sony, I'm blanking on his name, had it. Where they not only understood the technology, but they had a fingertip feel, and I keep using that word for kind of that intangible feel of customer needs. And, you know, other people built computers when he was building them. Other people had music players when, you know, the iPod came out. And, you know, Palm had a phone that had a browser. But he had the right irrational combination of being an asshole for, you know, no, truly depending. By the way, I own the shortest interview on record for Steve Jobs. Is that, I don't know if you know, Jobs used to like to walk his interviewees around. My best friend was his VP of hardware engineering for 13 years, John Rubinstein. And so Ruby got me an interview as his VP of marketing at Next. And so Jobs and I go out for a walk. And then with about 100 yards, I realized he doesn't want a VP of marketing. He wants somebody to do what he tells him to. And I had such a large ego, I go, this guy doesn't know a thing about marketing. You're all supposed to laugh, you know, right? Well, duh. The guy was the best marketeer in Silicon Valley. Wasn't clear at the time because he was coming off the failure in Apple. But so just as I'm thinking of that, Steve looks at me and says, what do you say we turn around? And so I get back and my friend Ruby is going, that's the shortest interview I've ever seen. Luckily for both of us. But I don't know. What was the question?
Do you think that Steve Jobs used?
Yeah, so Jobs, it truly had that combination of science and talent, but again, because I happen to know as VP of engineering, it's not that Jobs was sitting in a lead-lined room, you know, in a Zen Lotus position with the lightning bolts coming out of his head. He was constantly getting customer data, you know, some of it from his heads of engineering. But my best example, and one I saw personally, is, you know, when the Apple Store in Palo Alto opened, I think it was the 5th or 6th Apple Store in the country. I lived a mile one way, or half a mile, and he lived half a mile the other. And I would see him in that Apple Store maybe once a week. And I'm sure the press must have seen him there, but no one ever asked, how come Steve Jobs can't get a computer delivered to his house? Because Jobs was not in that store to buy a computer. He was watching customers. He wasn't watching the employees. He was looking at what. So, and by the way, the other thing people never noticed. Anybody remember when Steve was alive? You'd always hear a rumor of he personally answered an email, right? Did anybody remember that? Mm-hmm. And the answers were always either no or fuck you. I mean, right? No one ever asked, was that the only email he read that one month? Of course not. Jobs actually was reading every email that was sent to him from a customer. So the answer is no, I don't think Steve Jobs did customer discovery in the traditional way, but also thinking that he was completely locked out of customer input and feedback is also incredibly naive. It's in fact probably the most detrimental thing the Apple PR machine ever did was Steve Jobs, you know, some fantasy story of it all sprung from his imagination. It actually sprung from somebody who had probably the best attuned customer discovery antenna I've ever seen, but it was not bereft any input. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'm going to take the 3 questions from the 3 people who are standing. So if you haven't gotten up yet, you missed your window.
And these are the 3 best questions, right?
No pressure.
I hope so. Steve, thanks for a talk so far. What do you think of a single founder startup versus nowadays you have to have a hustler?
Yeah, kind of like one hand clapping. So it doesn't mean you have 0 odds succeeding, but there is kind of a bell curve of experience that says, you know, it's kind of like having a conversation with yourself. So I guess if you're schizophrenic, it probably works.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Over here. And I think this is...
I didn't say it's kind of like having sex with yourself, so...
Steve, my name is Diana. What do you think of friction and the way it affects entrepreneurs?
It's not related to the last question, Steve. It's unrelated.
As entrepreneurs, we all face similar challenges. Connect to the right people in every discipline, pair people, find the right scientists, or there's a lot of disconnect, especially around the world. All of these cities are trying to bridge their people, to help people connect, to find the next Steve Jobs, help them meet the next Wozniak. Well, here in the Silicon Valley, it's kind of an opposite paradigm. Investors seem to want to filter out, to add friction to entrepreneurs, so they struggle through it so that the best ones surface. It's almost like a completely opposite paradigm. Is the Silicon Valley an example of the ultimate efficiency in entrepreneurship? Or is the opposite? If we create something that does the opposite, actually removes that friction, helps everybody connect to the right person, the anti-LinkedIn, where it doesn't matter who you know, would that negatively affect the entrepreneurs if the Silicon Valley believes that friction is good for them?
That's a great question. That's probably going to turn into my next blog post. No, don't leave. I think that... That's really both smart and shows a lot of wisdom, and I'm going to answer shortly, and then I'll babble for a while. I don't know is the answer, but it's a great question. And then second is, it's a great question because what's happened, how long have you been an entrepreneur?
2 years.
Great. So what you don't remember, and I'm saying this nicely, is that it used to be that entrepreneurial knowledge was transmitted via the amount of the bandwidth was limited by the amount of caffeine you could consume. Seriously, if you think about it, the way we passed entrepreneurial knowledge and data was having coffee here in Silicon Valley with other entrepreneurs or maybe VCs. What's happened literally in the last 10 or 15 years is that knowledge for entrepreneurship has gone, via the internet, and so now any country, any city, any place, et cetera, knows more about entrepreneurship than all Silicon Valley did 30 years ago. That's a little scary. The second is that the cost of at least starting a software startup has plummeted by maybe 1,000x, and I'm serious, 1,000x. When I was an entrepreneur, now old guy telling story, but whatever it was required a fax. So there was $1 million just to write software. Now Amazon Web Services, has changed the game. We take for granted that computing is a utility, that on your laptop you have more computers than anyone on the world, except for maybe, the National Security Agency. And they're probably using those same computers too. So the part that's missing is that while everywhere else in the world has entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial data and access to software horsepower, what it doesn't have, and what we still have here, and so I'm backing into thinking about the answer to your question, is it doesn't have the accumulation and concentration of risk capital like we do. By risk capital, that's a fancy term for angel and venture capital. And so what Silicon Valley still owns is an obscene collection of people willing to take risk on a scale not duplicated in many other places. I mean, New York has kind of emerged, and Beijing for social media, and maybe we could argue London and San Diego for life sciences, but nothing like the Valley. And different rules are kind of emerging, as you called friction. And so I still don't know the answer to your question, but I think that's what makes this place different. This is still kind of like Rome or Florence in the Middle Ages, or London or Paris at the turn of the 20th century. It is pretty unique. It's now not the only place, but it is still kind of the center because of density of both entrepreneurship and the capital required to fuel it. Obviously, Kickstarter and other things have allowed other places to seed them, but for capital at scale, that is, people willing to not only make 100 grand angel bets, but $100 million bets, this is the place where those deals get done. Does that? And I know I didn't answer your question, but I need to think about it. That was a great. You've won the best question of the night so far. So now it's up to you to see if you could beat that.
That's good.
Okay, no pressure.
Yeah, she set the bar pretty high. Hi, my name is Yong. Thanks so much for your speech. I came over from the East Coast. I don't know if you have read a book by your colleague.
East Coast. Yeah, I know where that is.
I know. Sure. But I mean,
I left there and I'm never going back.
Your colleague Bill Olet over at MIT wrote a book called The Disciplined Approach Towards Entrepreneurship. I was wondering, from your perspective, if there's kind of a structured approach towards entrepreneurship for people who, like me, who don't have much experience in this field. Thanks.
Yeah, so the thing I've been alluding to, I like Bill and I like his book, but it's basically kind of every possible menu item in his book. I don't know how to do all those things. And so the lean startup is kind of a very simple thing, and I would pick some methodology that you feel comfortable with. Doesn't have to be lean, it could be something else, but I would pick one and kind of stick to it. And as I said, the lean startup is, realizing that all you have on day one is a series of untested hypotheses, using business model to kind of frame them, some way to test them. Customer development, is one method, and one way to build MVPs, using agile engineering. I would be thinking about something like that. Or if you don't like that, pick some other method. Only problem with Bill's book is it has 24 different methods, and I don't know how to do all 24 of them at the same time. So that would be my 2 cents. And the Startup Owner's Manual, which is the last book I wrote, truly is a cookbook. The 4 Steps to the Epiphany was kind of the observation that we needed to do something different. Startup Owner's Manual, if you're interested, happens to be the cookbook, but I'm not pitching the book as the answer. Just as an aside, thank you. The lean startup is not the answer to startups. I want you to make sure you've heard it here. It's a answer. A answer. You might have a much better answer. Whoever said, how do we build MVPs might have a better answer. The last thing you want to do is take advice from someone like it's gospel, including me or anybody else you hear. They're all opinions until you match them with some profound beliefs you have. And I guess the first thing I would observe is if you don't have any profound beliefs, you need to get some. And then you can take tonight's stuff and kind of match it against your profound beliefs. But you don't really have to agree with it. It just happens to be my version of pattern recognition. But some of you, hopefully, will come up with better versions. I don't think the lean startup is the end of anything. I think it was a radical break with the past, and I'm hoping that in the next couple of years we'll be building on top of it and doing much better stuff. I think we've seen that it's much more efficient than what we've been doing. So thank you.
Excellent. So Steve, tonight you've answered about a dozen questions from me, 10 questions from the audience. We started with a much longer list. You do a lot of these events. What's the question you wish people were asking you? What's the answer you want to give and nobody seems to ask that question? This is your chance.
Wow, I don't know. Everybody's always been polite going, the question I'd be asking me is, if you're so damn smart, how come you were never able to finish college? I'd be asking that one. I mean, I don't know.
So if you're so damn smart, why didn't you ever finish college?
So I find it ironic. You should know I'm going to let you all in a secret. The other question that people have never asked, it's my only vice, is I carry in my wallet the faculty cards from 5 major universities just to kind of look at and giggle every once in a while. I take them out and kind of laugh. And for my students who never bothered to ask, they could always get a refund if they wanted to. I've after being an educator now, and I can actually use that word after 13 or 14 years teaching, I'm now convinced that we've kind of put our educational institutions together for kind of a bell curve of modality of learning for maybe the majority of students, but there are outliers on both sides of the curve that just don't learn the way that our educational institutions are set up, and I fell into that category. I was a slow learner, I still am, and I got incredibly bored in school, but I was always running what I consider a neural net in background with a pattern recognizer going on continuously, and was a voraciously sucking in data from all possible sources, running those patterns against them, which both made me successful in startups and made me successful in, you used the word, I would have never used it, as a thought leader in trying to understand, were we missing something about how to construct new models of entrepreneurship? I tend to value, Peter Thiel is the one who says, oh, you shouldn't go to college, you should drop out, and there's other sides that say, no, that's insane. I think they're both missing the point, or who's ever taking that argument. There is a segment that actually college, and I was one of them, was just an incredible waste of time, though I did have to kind of recapitulate what everybody else learned in school just by reading myself. But most students actually can value and get incredible use, because that is how they learn the best. So I just find that an interesting conversation. I found it very interesting for my own life, and then when I had kids, watching how they learned was also kind of interesting, because my wife is the other extreme. My joke is we have 2 degrees in the family. Unfortunately, my wife has both of them, or not, or at least fortunately. I mean, she's the one with the MBA from Stanford. And every once in a while, when I was a marketeer, when I used to come home and say, hey, look at this, this thing's called the Dutch auction. And she'd say, well, if you would have went to business school, you would have known. It's like, and then I'd be like teaching myself statistics. And she said, well, yes, if you would have taken the class. And so that's the question.
So we've had scores of tweets come in this evening from people in the audience. The 6-word challenge of what is the challenge you are facing as an entrepreneur. And I have selected 2 that we would like to have you respond to these 6-word challenges. If we could ask Ray Kasbarian, could you come down to the mic?
In 6 words.
Is Ray here?
Oh, he was dialing it in.
Do they have to be present to win? They do. Okay, so Ray had a great 6-word tweet. I'm not going to tell you about it. Sayira Sulman, is Sayira here? Excellent. Sayira, if you would come down to the mic, I will then read your tweet so Steve can respond to it. I love this exercise. At TED a couple of years ago, they asked people to do 6-word responses to a question. And the question was, describe your first sexual experience. And there was a young man sitting next to me who was 16, and his mom was also at TED. And his 6 words were, mom in room, still a virgin. Sayira, her 6-word tweet about the challenge that she's facing is create viral growth in non-viral, hyphenated, business. Create viral growth in a non-viral business.
Yes.
Discuss.
So some businesses are just not viral. No, seriously, there are some businesses that you have to ask yourself, is the nature of the business just simply not viral and growth is incremental, like most traditional businesses, or is there some business model you could actually set up where you just haven't found, the virality factor? I'll give you an example. Dating services are not viral. Who wants to tell your friends you can't get a date? But they actually make good business models. There are lots of businesses like that, or drug businesses or illegal businesses or gambling businesses are not viral, but they do grow well. But the models themselves, and I'm not suggesting you're going to do any of those.
I think the only reason I was asking was because I'm working on something which is finance and investing related. And I've just noticed that, that is an area that's really not picked. And I was looking at all the viral loops and things like that, just because it's just so much easier to be able to engage people. And I know the only example that I could think of was basically Mint from almost quite some time ago, that they actually went and ended up getting a lot of growth, which was primarily in tracking your budgeting and so on. And when I asked this question of John Lilly, I think a couple of days ago, he said, look, if you look at Instagram, until they came about, nobody thought that you could look at pictures and make them shareable. So they were able to discover something. There's always that possibility.
You know what? You just gave me a good point. So lotteries are viral, right? They kind of depend on other people buying because they increase the value of the ultimate prize, right? So maybe something about your budget could be viral, but I don't know what it is. But I think you just gave me the Instagram version of this is, online lotteries where you could, watch the number increase. So if you're looking for examples in finance, you're just making me think that of all places I'd probably be looking, and no joke, it's Las Vegas. I'd be figuring out, are there any games with numbers that have some payoffs that might be, the concepts might be translatable into something social. But they require an invention of a new business model. And sometimes, as I said, sometimes businesses just aren't viral. Sometimes there are some big insights, but I don't know how you kind of force making them up.
Right.
If you can stay there, I'm going to go to the next person, and then we've got your prizes up here.
That's a good question.
Alexander Tislipkin. Is Alexander here? Yeah, that's me. Great. Alexander, if you can come up to the mic. His 6-word challenge. Oh, I should have mentioned Sierra's startup is Your Capital. Alexander's is Flexus. And his 6-word challenge is pivoting product while staying cash positive.
Okay. At least my definition of a pivot is a substantive change to one or more components of the business model canvas. And by the way, if you're changing a good number of them, sometimes it's actually a restart, meaning you get to keep the name of the company, but about everything else changes. I have to tell you, in fact, now you're making me think about this, that might not be a good idea. Not knowing the details of the business, but one of the things when you're living on a shoestring is when you see a new opportunity, thinking that you have to support all the other past customers sometimes becomes an albatross, both mentally and in your business, because, and again, I'm not going to give you this as advice, it's just a generic observation, but startups usually succeed when you burn the boats on the beach. Does anybody know where that phrase came from? It's historically, I don't know if it's an apocryphal tale, when Cortez landed on the shores of Mexico, he was facing this jungle and, like hostile indigenous people. His troops said, we're getting back on the boats. So that night when they were asleep, he burned the boats. The only place to go was forward into the jungle.
Had to go forward.
I'm not sure the outcome was good for everybody, but but seriously, you just asked to do something which may or may not be optimizing your attention on this next pivot space. But it really depends on, are you feeding a family off of this? Is this a small business? Can this scale? Are you sure this is where your pivot needs to go? You need to think about whether this is holding you back. That is that, gee, I need to support these. Sometimes you need to fire your customers. It's a big idea. And I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just suggesting you think about that.
Excellent. If we can get you both to come up, and if we can acknowledge them for their tweets, please come on up on stage. Come up this way. Those are for you to sign, yeah.